What if I told you that the most powerful decision in gospel music history wasn't made on stage, but in the quiet moment when someone chose to walk away from it? There's a man whose name you might not immediately recognize, yet his voice has moved millions. A man who stood shoulder to shoulder with gospel legends, whose baritone anchored one of the most celebrated vocal groups in Christian music, and who made a choice so rare in our fame-obsessed culture that it still leaves people stunned today. This isn't a story about rising to stardom. This is about something far more profound. It's about the courage to redefine success when the whole world is telling you you've already achieved it. Marshall Hall's story will challenge everything you think you know about what it means to truly succeed, and by the end, you might find yourself questioning your own definition of greatness. So stay with me, because what happened next in Marshall's journey revealed a truth that could transform how you see your own life's purpose. The spotlight has a gravitational pull. It draws people in, makes them feel alive, validates their worth. But here's what most people don't understand. The real test of character isn't whether you can read the spotlight. It's whether you can walk away from it when it conflicts with what matters most. Marshall Hall understood this in a way that most artists never will. Born in Springfield, Illinois in 1970, Marshall didn't grow up dreaming of stages and applause. He grew up in a home where Sunday wasn't just another day, it was the day. His father served as a church deacon, his mother taught Sunday school, and in the Hall household, faith wasn't compartmentalized into 1 hour on Sunday morning. It was woven into the fabric of everything they did. Picture this for a moment, a modest home in the heartland of America, where the smell of Sunday dinner mingles with the sound of hymns being practiced around an old piano. That was Marshall's childhood. And here's what's crucial to understand, because this shaped everything that came after. Marshall didn't learn music as a performance art first. He learned it as a language of worship, as a conversation with the divine, as something sacred before it was ever entertaining. Young Marshall would sit in those church services, not just listening but absorbing. He watched how music could transform a room, how the right melody could open hearts that had been closed, how harmony could create unity among people who disagreed on everything else. Music in Marshall's world was never just sound. It was ministry. It was connection. It was purpose. And this is where his story diverges from so many others who enter the music industry. While other kids might have been dreaming of record deals and radio play, teenage Marshall was leading worship at his local church, writing songs not for charts but for hearts. He once reflected on those early days with striking humility. I wasn't trying to be famous or anything. I just wanted to use music to help people connect with God. Now, think about that statement for a second. In a culture where everyone is hustling for visibility, where social media has turned us all into personal brand managers, here was someone whose primary motivation was service, not recognition. This wasn't false modesty or some rehearsed line for interviews. This was the foundational principle that would guide every major decision Marshall would make for the rest of his life. The songs Marshall wrote in those small sanctuaries were different. They weren't trying to be catchy. They weren't designed to climb any charts. They were raw, honest expressions of faith, filled with spiritual depth, that came from genuine wrestling with belief, doubt, hope, and grace. These weren't the polished, radio-friendly songs that dominate Christian music today. These were prayers, set to melody, meditations on what it means to trust God when life doesn't make sense, reflections on grace that transforms ordinary moments into sacred ones. And people noticed, not because Marshall was self-promoting, but because authenticity has a way of cutting through noise. His talent for capturing the unvarnished emotions of faith in song began to draw attention beyond his small church community. But here's what makes this part of the story so important. Success found Marshall. He didn't chase it. There's a massive difference between those two paths, and it would define everything about his career. After high school, Marshall made his way to Nashville, the beating heart of Christian music in America. But his journey to Music City wasn't like the thousands of others who arrived there every year with stars in their eyes and demo tapes in their hands. Marshall came quietly, humbly, without the fanfare or the desperate hunger for fame that characterizes so many artists who make that pilgrimage. And what did he do when he got there? He became a background vocalist. Think about that. Here's a man with genuine talent, with songwriting ability, with a voice that could carry a lead, and he chose to serve in the shadows. He lent his rich baritone to albums by some of the biggest names in Christian and gospel music, adding depth and warmth to their melodies, bringing their songs to life with his steady, smooth vocals. Most people would see background work as a stepping stone, something to endure until you get your big break. Marshall saw it as his calling in that season. He wasn't impatiently waiting for his moment. He was faithfully serving in the moment he had been given. Here's a principle that changes everything when you really grasp it: faithfulness in obscurity is what prepares you for responsibility in visibility. Marshall was learning the industry, honing his craft, developing his character, building relationships, all while staying true to his calling of musical ministry. He wasn't networking with ulterior motives. He wasn't trying to use people as stepping stones. He was simply being excellent at what he did, showing up with professionalism and heart, earning a reputation not for being the most talented or the most ambitious, but for being the most dependable and genuine. Studio work also gave Marshall the space to develop his songwriting. His compositions continued to be prayers in motion, never chasing commercial success or catchy hooks, but exploring themes of faith, hope, and grace with increasing depth. He was storing up spiritual and creative reserves, preparing for something he couldn't yet see but was being prepared for nonetheless. Then came 2004, and the call that would change everything. Bill Gaither, a living legend in gospel music, invited Marshall to join the Gaither Vocal Band. Now, if you know anything about Christian music, you understand the magnitude of this invitation. The Gaither Vocal Band wasn't just another group. It was an institution. They were known for rich harmonies that could make you weep, uplifting melodies that could lift the heaviest spirits, and performances that left audiences transformed. To be invited into this group wasn't just a career opportunity. It was, as Marshall understood it, a ministry calling. And this distinction matters enormously. When you view your work as merely a job, you show up differently than when you view it as a calling. When it's just a career move, you're thinking about what you can get from it. When it's a calling, you're thinking about what you can give through it. Marshall joined the band, and something remarkable happened. His mellow baritone didn't just blend with the other voices. It became essential to their sound. He stood alongside powerhouses like Guy Penrod with his commanding vocals and David Phelps with his soaring tenor, and Marshall's voice was the steady foundation that allowed their brilliance to shine. Here's what's fascinating about Marshall's role in the group. He never tried to compete with the showmanship around him. In a lineup of extraordinary talents and strong personalities, Marshall brought something different. He brought steadiness, he brought calm, he brought emotional depth without drama, power without pretense. His bandmates would later describe how his presence had a settling effect, how his quiet strength balanced the group's energy, how he held things together not by dominating, but by simply being fully present and fully himself. The songs Marshall performed with the Gaither Vocal Band became classics. Yes, I Know, Loving God, Loving Each Other, Glorious, Impossible. When Marshall sang these songs, something happened. There were no vocal gymnastics for show, no manufactured emotion, no performance tricks designed to manipulate an audience response. Just truth, delivered with sincerity and depth. Just worship, offered with a whole heart. Just ministry, carried out with excellence and humility. Audiences could feel the difference. When Marshall sang, you weren't watching a performance, you were being invited into worship. And here's a crucial insight about why his approach was so powerful. In a culture saturated with spectacle, authenticity becomes magnetic. We're so accustomed to being sold to, performed at, manipulated by calculated emotional appeal, that when we encounter someone who is simply being genuine, it stops us in our tracks. For 5 years, Marshall toured with the Gaither Vocal Band. 5 years of stages and spotlights, of recording sessions and television appearances, of touching lives and seeing God move through music. The group traveled constantly, performing for packed venues across the nation and beyond. Marshall became a familiar face to thousands of gospel music fans. His voice was heard in homes, churches, and cars across America. By any conventional measure, this was the peak. This was what success looked like. This was the dream realized. And then, in 2009, at the absolute height of his time with the band, Marshall made a decision that shocked everyone. He quietly announced he was leaving the group. Fans were confused. His bandmates were surprised. The industry was baffled. Why would someone walk away when everything looked so perfect? What could possibly make someone leave when they were experiencing the kind of success most artists only dream about? Here's where we need to pause and really sit with what happened next, because this is the heart of Marshall's story and the reason it matters so much. The answer wasn't scandal. It wasn't burnout. It wasn't artistic differences or a better offer from another group. The answer was profoundly simple and yet radically countercultural. Marshall chose his family over his fame. He chose his calling over his career. He chose obedience to what he felt God asking of him over the ambition to keep climbing. And in making that choice, Marshall revealed something that our culture desperately needs to understand. Sometimes the most significant thing you can do is step back, not step up. Sometimes strength looks like saying no to good things in order to say yes to the most important things. Sometimes the truest measure of success isn't what you achieve, but what you're willing to sacrifice for what matters most. Marshall had been honest with himself about the cost of his success. The constant touring meant missing bedtimes and school plays, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesday evenings. The demands of recording and performing meant his energy and attention were always divided. He could be physically present at home between tours, but mentally still on the road, emotionally depleted from giving himself to audiences. His children were growing up, and he was watching it happen in snapshots rather than experiencing it in the day-to-day moments that actually form a childhood. His marriage, while strong, was bearing the strain of his absence, and Marshall looked at his life with brutal honesty and asked himself a question that every person needs to ask at some point. What do I want to be known for? When my life is over, what will matter most? What legacy am I actually building? The decision Marshall faced isn't unique to famous musicians. It's the same decision countless people face in different forms. The executive who has to choose between the promotion that requires relocating or staying near aging parents. The entrepreneur who has to decide whether to scale the business or scale back for the sake of their marriage. The professional who has to weigh career advancement against being present for their kids' formative years. Marshall's decision was made on a bigger stage, but the principle applies universally. You cannot serve two masters, and you will eventually have to choose what you value most. What made Marshall's choice so remarkable wasn't just that he chose family. It's that he chose it when the cost was so visible. He wasn't leaving a job he hated. He was leaving a position he loved, a ministry he valued, a platform he'd worked years to reach. The sacrifice was real. The loss was tangible. And he chose it anyway, because he had clarity about his priorities. Think about the courage that required in an industry that measures worth by visibility and validates significance through success. Marshall walked away from both. He knew people would question his decision. He knew some would see it as throwing away an opportunity. He knew the music would continue without him, that someone else would fill his spot, that the spotlight would move on, and he chose his family anyway. He chose presence over prominence. He chose the slow, quiet work of fatherhood and marriage over the adrenaline of stage and applause. This wasn't about Marshall not valuing his work with the Gaither Vocal Band. He treasured those years. It wasn't about him not recognizing the impact of that ministry. He knew lives were being touched. But he also knew that no amount of impact out there could justify neglecting his primary ministry at home. His first calling was to his wife and children. His first congregation was gathered around his dinner table, and when he got clear about that, the decision, while difficult, became obvious. After Marshall left the Gaither Vocal Band, his life didn't end, it transformed. He redirected his creative energy into songwriting, now with more time to process and reflect. His songs became even more personal, infused with the lessons he was learning about grace in ordinary life, about obedience that cost something, about the joys and struggles of showing up day after day for the people you love. He continued to minister, but in smaller, more intimate settings, local churches, worship conferences, mentoring young musicians who needed guidance, not just about music, but about navigating the industry with integrity. Marshall became valued not just for his vocal ability, but for his character, his wisdom, his genuine spiritual leadership. People sought him out not because he was famous, but because he was authentic. At home, Marshall's family flourished. He was fully present now, not just physically in the house, but emotionally available, mentally engaged. He coached his kids' teams, attended their concerts, sat at the breakfast table with them, checking his phone, had long conversations that wandered wherever they needed to go. He invested in his marriage with the same intentionality he had once given to his music career. He became a student of his wife's heart, a partner in the daily logistics and emotional work of family life. He showed up for church not as a visiting artist but as a regular member, serving on rotation, praying with people, living in community. Here's what Marshall discovered that so few people understand until they experience it. The most meaningful work often happens in the moments nobody sees. The legacy that actually lasts isn't built on stages, it's built at home. The impact that matters most isn't measured in audience size, but in the depth of your relationships with the people closest to you. Those late-night conversations with a teenager struggling with their faith. Those quiet moments rocking a sick child. Those ordinary dinners where nothing particularly significant happens except everyone is together and present. Those morning coffees with your spouse where you reconnect before the day pulls you apart. These are the moments that form a life. These are the investments that compound. These are the choices that you'll look back on with either deep satisfaction or profound regret. And Marshall chose satisfaction. He chose to build something that would outlast any recording, any performance, any accolade. Now, years removed from his time with the Gaither Vocal Band, Marshall's legacy is secure, but not in the way the music industry typically measures legacy. He doesn't have the most awards, or the biggest platform, or the longest discography. What Marshall has is something far more valuable: integrity intact, family thriving, faith deepened, and a life lived in alignment with his values. The people who were impacted by his time with the Gaither Vocal Band still treasure those recordings, still find comfort and inspiration in his performances. But the people who know Marshall personally, the young musicians he's mentored, the church communities he served, his children who grew up with a father who chose them, they know him as something more than a great voice. They know him as a man who understood what really matters and had the courage to live accordingly. Marshall Hall's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own lives. Are we chasing achievements that ultimately won't satisfy? Are we building careers at the expense of our closest relationships? Are we so focused on what we're accomplishing that we're missing what we're sacrificing? Are we letting the world define success for us, or are we having the courage to define it for ourselves based on what we genuinely value? These aren't easy questions, and there aren't universal answers that apply to everyone. But Marshall's example gives us a framework for thinking about them. He shows us that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is slow down. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is choosing the less impressive path. Sometimes Wisdom looks like walking away from opportunities that don't align with your deepest priorities. Sometimes courage is displayed not in what you pursue, but in what you're willing to release. In a gospel culture that often celebrates the spectacular, the supernatural, the dramatic moves of God, Marshall quietly testified to a different kind of miracle, the transformation that happens when you consistently choose obedience over ambition, when you value faithfulness over fame, when you measure your life by the health of your relationships rather than the height of your achievements. His life whispers a truth that our noise-saturated culture needs to hear. You don't have to be the loudest voice to have the most impact. You don't have to be in the spotlight to live a significant life. You don't have to chase fame to fulfill your purpose. Sometimes the most powerful ministry happens in the margins, in the background. The small and ordinary moments that no one is watching or recording or applauding. And those moments, those quiet choices, those daily acts of love and presence and faithfulness, these are what actually change the world. Marshall Hall never set out to be famous, and when fame found him, he never let it define him. He remained grounded in his faith, anchored in his values, clear about his priorities. He understood that he was a steward of his gifts, not the owner of them. He knew that his voice was meant to serve something larger than his own success. And when the season came to use that voice differently, in smaller rooms and quieter ways, he embraced it without bitterness or regret. There's a beautiful freedom in that kind of surrender. A peace that comes from releasing your grip on outcomes and trusting that your worth isn't determined by your visibility. Marshall discovered what many people never learn, that you can lose the spotlight and still be exactly where you're meant to be, that you can decrease in public prominence and increase in personal significance, that the best chapters of your life might be the ones nobody else sees.